If you don't know me, I'm Francis Moroney. I am an architectural historian, and I've been at this for a really long time. I'm going to be talking about 20th century classicism together with all of the other trends in 20th century architecture. I will be talking about some of those things that another speaker might actually leave out. But I'm not going to leave those things out. To me, 20th century architecture is kind of a diverse, almost giddily diverse thing. And when you look at the standard textbook on the subject, that aspect of it isn't highlighted at all. To the contrary, many architectural historians take the view that there is a kind of narrative of 20th century architecture. There is a sort of progression towards different forms. And you'll find, if you don't know this about me already, you'll find that I don't accept that. I don't accept that there is a narrative. I think that there are many narratives, and it's sort of been my purpose as an architectural historian all of these years to talk about the different narratives that exist and not just the one. I'm sure that this isn't the first slide you expected to see in a course on 20th century architecture in New York. But to me, as I was thinking about how I wanted to tell this story, this sets the mood, because 20th century architecture really begins in New York and elsewhere with a change in mood, not a change necessarily in architectural styles or forms, but a change in mood. And this, I think, captures it. Mrs. Vanderbilt moves to the slums. Mrs. Vanderbilt was Anne Harriman Sands Rutherford Vanderbilt, and this is the slum that she moved to, 1 Sutton Place. Now, I'm sure that any of you who know Sutton Place and have looked at this house don't think of it as a slum property. After all, after Mrs. Vanderbilt lived there, J. Paul Getty lived there, and so on. It's not a slum property. But you know, when Mrs. Vanderbilt moved there, indeed, Sutton Place was a slum, or people called it that. We don't really use that word much anymore, but back in the day people did. And what they meant by that word was that the area was, first of all, poor. It was a working class neighborhood. There were tenements, and the brownstones that you see here were subdivided. They were rooming houses or boarding houses. There was a lot of industry in the neighborhood. There were coal yards and brick yards and breweries and a lot of noisome waterfront enterprises. And it was a shocking thing when Mrs. Vanderbilt decided, oh, that's where I want to live. Here you see a before shot of Sutton Place. This was before its redevelopment, which began around 1920. And this is that same block after renovation. Yeah? Yeah. The brownstones were remodeled beyond all recognition, as the neighborhood was claimed by a much better off class of people than had been living there. It went from being a working class neighborhood to being one of the most upper class neighborhoods in New York City. We have a word for this process. That word is what? Gentrification, right, a word that wasn't coined until 1964, but that doesn't mean that the phenomenon didn't exist. Indeed, it did in 1920. Indeed, this may even be regarded as the golden age of gentrification in New York City. And it was this row house renovation movement that, for me, really sort of shows the change in mood that I'm talking about. The reason for gentrification is that it was no longer possible for well-to-do New Yorkers to build themselves new houses in new neighborhoods. There were no new neighborhoods. Manhattan was used up by about 1900. There was no new uptown pasture to move to any longer. And building new houses, which was what upper-class New Yorkers had always done, was prohibitively expensive. So most upper-class New Yorkers bit the bullet, accepted the inevitable, and moved into apartment buildings. But others decided, you know what, we can kind of double back to our old neighborhoods and buy up these houses for very cheap and hire a clever young architect and make it into something that is unique and kind of exciting. This is the house that Mrs. Vanderbilt lived in before she moved to Sutton Place. We say Mrs. Vanderbilt, leaving out Mr. Vanderbilt, because he died. And when he did so, he left his widow this spectacular Richard Morris Hunt house in view of many, the greatest of all Richard Morris Hunt's houses in New York City. This is the house about which Charles Follen McKim said after it was built, "I sleep better at night knowing it's there." And it set the whole vogue for chateau-style houses, not just in New York, but in America. Anyway, Mrs. Vanderbilt didn't want to live in this house anymore. She really wanted to take her whole lifestyle down a notch. The change in mood that I'm talking about, it's in part a rejection of the Gilded Age, of which Mrs. Vanderbilt had been